April 6, 1945, the skies over Okinawa burned with the sound of engines and dying men. From the decks of American destroyers, sailors stared into a rising sun filled with hundreds of kamikaze aircraft diving toward them, pilots who had no plans to return. But hidden inside the barrels of the fleet's 5-inch guns was a secret weapon, a tiny electronic brain that would decide who lived and who died. This was the day technology met human sacrifice and won. Dawn, April 6, 1945. The East China Sea lay calm for the last time. On the radar picket line, 16 miles ahead of the American invasion fleet off Okinawa, small destroyers like USS Laffey and USS Bush waited alone. They were the first to see death coming, the first to die if they failed. Inside the Combat Information Center of USS Leutze, radar operators whispered over static, tracing dots that multiplied faster than they could count. What they saw wasn't a raid, it was an oncoming storm. Over 300 Japanese aircraft had taken off from Kyushu that morning. Fighters, bombers, and hundreds of kamikaze pilots, each one a guided weapon of flesh and steel, flying toward eternity. The Americans had seen suicide planes before, but never like this. This was Operation Kikusui No. 1, the first of 10 massive, coordinated attacks meant to annihilate the fleet before Okinawa could fall. Every sailor knew what that meant. There would be no rescue, no retreat, only survival or fire. On the destroyer's decks, 5-inch gun crews worked in silence, loading shells marked with a strange new symbol, VT. Few of them knew what it meant. Inside those steel casings, scientists had hidden something unimaginable, a radio transmitter, a sensor, a tiny brain that could think in the air. As the first enemy wave appeared on the horizon, sunlight caught the glint of diving planes. The sound grew, hundreds of engines screaming toward the fleet. And below, the guns of Task Force 58 came alive. The battle for Okinawa had begun, and the future of warfare was about to change forever. The idea that saved thousands of lives was born not in a battleship, but in a laboratory. 2 years earlier, 1942, America's biggest war wasn't against Japan or Germany. It was against time. The Allies were losing men faster than they could train them. Bombers missed their targets. Anti-aircraft guns fired endlessly into empty skies, and every shell that didn't hit its mark meant another crew dead. Something had to change. In Washington, a small group of physicists, engineers, and dreamers gathered under a name that sounded more like an insurance company than a secret weapon. Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. Their mission, to make bullets smart. The concept was simple in theory. A fuse that would detonate a shell not on impact, but when it came close enough to its target. But in 1942, that idea bordered on science fiction. To work, the fuse would need to sense its surroundings, calculate distance in milliseconds, and survive being fired from a cannon, all while enduring 20,000 Gs of acceleration. No one believed it could be done, no one except a few stubborn men, among them Dr. Merle Tuve of Johns Hopkins University. Tuve's team at the Applied Physics Laboratory began experimenting with tiny vacuum tubes, fragile glass components that shattered under the slightest pressure. Yet they persisted, creating versions smaller and tougher than anyone thought possible. They called it the variable time fuse, or VT fuse, though in reality, it wasn't variable at all. It was alive. Inside each one was a miniature radio transmitter that sent out waves as the shell flew through the air. When those waves bounced back off a nearby aircraft, the fuse detected the echo and detonated at the perfect distance, creating a lethal sphere of shrapnel around the target. But making it work was only half the battle. The other half was keeping it secret. If the Germans or Japanese ever discovered how it functioned, they could copy or counter it. So, the fuse was guarded like a nuclear secret. Soldiers who used it were ordered never to recover duds, never to open unexploded rounds, and never, under any circumstance, to let one fall into enemy hands. Early versions were rushed to the Pacific Theater in late 1943. They were first tested against Japanese aircraft attacking the Solomon Islands. The results were astonishing. Anti-aircraft gunners who once needed hundreds of rounds to hit a single plane were suddenly destroying enemies with just a few shots. Commanders couldn't believe the reports until they saw it themselves. Soon, every U.S. Navy ship in the Pacific was stocked with the new VT shells. By 1944, They had become the unseen guardians of the fleet, each one capable of turning a near miss into a kill. But their true test, the test that would define their legacy, came in 1945, when Japan unleashed its final, most desperate weapon, the kamikaze. These weren't ordinary attacks. They were acts of devotion and despair. Young men, barely 20, writing farewell letters, drinking sake, and boarding aircraft loaded with bombs. They believed their deaths could turn back the tide of war. For the men of the U.S. Navy, it was a nightmare. Conventional gunfire often failed to stop the suiciders before impact. The kamikaze didn't need to live, they only needed to reach the ship. But this time, something was different. As the Japanese planes descended toward the fleet at Okinawa, the 5-inch guns of destroyers like the USS Laffey fired VT-fused shells into the sky. Each round exploded in mid-air, perfectly timed, filling the path ahead of the kamikaze with a storm of lethal fragments. One by one, the attackers fell, not by luck, not by chance, but by invisible precision. The sailors who once watched helplessly now saw hope in every explosion. In that moment, the fuse's creators, scientists who had fought their war in silence, had changed the fate of men thousands of miles away. The age of electronic warfare had begun. April 16, 1945, Okinawa. By dawn, the horizon looked like the end of the world. Smoke plumes clawed at the sky as hundreds of black dots appeared over the sea, kamikaze aircraft, diving in waves straight toward the picket line. On the USS Laffey, the crew called her the ship that would not die. She was small, fast, and exposed. Her job was to spot incoming raids before they reached the main fleet. That morning, she would become a target for 22 Japanese aircraft. At 8:30, the first warning came from radar. Bandits inbound, range 22 miles. The ship's crew braced. Men slammed hatches shut, loaders hoisted shells into the guns, and gunners strapped themselves to their mounts. Above them, the sound of the sky thickened, like distant thunder growing closer. Then came the voice over the loudspeaker. "Commence firing!" The destroyer erupted. 5-inch guns thundered, filling the air with smoke and fury. But this time it wasn't blind fire. Every round that left the barrels carried a secret, the VT fuse. As the first kamikaze approached, the gunners aimed, fired, and watched. Nothing seemed to hit. Then suddenly, a flash. Mid-air. A plane that hadn't been touched by a direct shell broke apart in a cloud of debris. The crew stood stunned for a second, then realized what they were seeing. The fuse was working. Another plane dove through the smoke. Before it could reach the deck, another shell exploded beside it, shredding the wings clean off. In less than a minute, 5 attackers were downed, but the Japanese kept coming. They came low, skimming the waves, zigzagging through the shrapnel clouds. The air was filled with the shriek of engines, tracer fire, and screaming men. One plane hit the aft gun mount, erupting in fire. Another crashed into the deckhouse, killing sailors where they stood. Yet the Laffey fought on. Every time her gunners fired, the proximity fuses detonated their shells in perfect bursts. Invisible sentinels that turned airspace into a minefield. One kamikaze, seeing the carnage ahead, tried to pull away. But a VT shell detonated 5 meters from his cockpit, tearing the plane apart before it could escape. Observers on nearby ships couldn't believe it. Destroyers were surviving attacks that would have destroyed entire convoys a year earlier. For the sailors on board, the fuse was nothing short of a miracle. They didn't fully understand it, only that when it worked, death stayed a few meters farther away. Over the next hour, USS Laffey was hit by 6 kamikaze planes and 4 bombs, yet she refused to sink. Her gunners burned, bleeding, deafened, kept firing until the last attacker vanished in flames. Farther south, the same story repeated. On the USS Hugh W. Hadley, another picket destroyer, the radar scope filled with blips, more than 150 aircraft approaching in waves. For 90 minutes she fought alone, shooting down 23 planes, more than any other ship in a single engagement of the war. The deck ran slick with oil and blood. Men shouted through the roar of the guns, and still the VT fuses worked, detonating shells just meters from their targets, killing pilots before they could dive. It was a battle no human could have survived on instinct alone. Only technology could. By the end of that day, The Kamikaze had sunk 2 destroyers and damaged many others, but without the VT fuse, the toll would have been catastrophic. The Japanese had launched over 1,500 aircraft in the first Kikusui attacks. Nearly half were shot down before ever reaching their targets. Admiral Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, later wrote, "If we had possessed this fuse earlier, we could have saved hundreds of ships and thousands of men." The sailors didn't speak of the fuse in grand terms. They didn't call it genius or science. They called it luck. To them, it was the difference between watching a friend burn or seeing him live another minute. As the battles at Okinawa raged on through April and May, the VT fuse became the invisible guardian of every gun barrel in the fleet. Kamikaze pilots still came, brave, fanatical and unrelenting. But now, for the first time, the Americans had something faster than courage, something colder than faith, precision. Each time a suicide plane was torn apart in midair, the men aboard the ships felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that they'd live. Sorrow for the young man who wouldn't. Because through all the chaos, one thing was clear. Both sides were fighting with everything they had left. The sea was turning red, the sky black, and between them floated the last miracle of the war. A tiny metal fuse, no bigger than a thumb, carrying inside it the hopes of every man who still wanted to see home again. By late April 1945, Okinawa had become hell afloat. Every dawn, the horizon glowed not with sunlight, but with fire. Black columns rose where ships had been. Kamikaze planes came by the hundreds, day after day, in swarms that seemed endless. To the sailors who lived through it, there were no longer battles. Only hours of life borrowed between alarms. At sea, the picket destroyers bore the brunt. They were small, expendable, and alone, sent miles ahead of the main fleet to absorb the first wave of suicide attacks. Each one carried barely 300 men in the faint hope that someone, somewhere, would be watching their radar screens when the dots appeared. For them, survival depended on the unseen, a fuse the size of a matchbox, pulsing with invisible energy. As the days dragged on, it became clear that the proximity fuse wasn't just a new invention. It was a turning point in naval warfare itself. Before it, anti-aircraft fire was blind. Crews aimed by instinct, guessing where an enemy plane might be seconds later, firing endless rounds that usually missed by yards. But now the sky had become a trap. Every near miss exploded automatically, or detonating at just the right distance, shredding aircraft that once would have slipped through. From the carrier decks of Task Force 58 to the smallest destroyer, every gunner knew this little fuse was their lifeline. Yet even miracles came with a price. On April 12th, off Okinawa, the USS Kidd took a direct hit. The Kamikaze struck her amidships, killing 38 men. The fuse had saved countless ships before, but nothing could protect against sheer human will, the pilot who refused to pull away. As fire swept the deck, survivors dragged wounded men to safety, their ears ringing with the same sounds they'd heard every day for weeks. Sirens, gunfire, and the terrible roar of another diving engine. The Japanese called it Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. To them, the suicide squadrons were flowers offered to the emperor. To the Americans, they were a storm of steel petals that never stopped falling. At night, the sea glowed with burning oil, and the air reeked of cordite and salt. Sailors sat on the decks, smoking in silence, staring at the distant flames. Some cursed the pilots, others pitied them. They were young, too young. Many barely out of flight school, their letters home still in their pockets. What no one could see from the decks below was how much the tide had already turned. Behind the chaos, the VT fuse was rewriting the future of war. Each kamikaze attack that failed meant fewer Japanese planes, fewer trained pilots, and fewer chances to break through. Radar pickets that once had minutes to react now had precious seconds, just enough to fill the air with smart shrapnel before the attackers arrived. American commanders began to notice something extraordinary. Ships equipped with full stocks of VT shells were surviving longer, shooting down more planes and saving entire convoys behind them. The fleet was bleeding, yes, but it wasn't dying. The fuse had changed the mathematics of defense. Before, it might take hundreds of shells to bring down one attacker. Now it took 5, sometimes 3, sometimes 1. The numbers were staggering. During the Okinawa campaign, over 7,800 Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. fleet. Thanks to the proximity fuse, nearly 5,000 were destroyed before impact, an impossible figure only months earlier. But for the men living through it, numbers meant little. Every kill was just one less scream, one less explosion, one more breath. Sailors began to call the VT fuse the guardian angel. It became a quiet superstition, a thing you didn't talk about, but everyone trusted. Some men rubbed the shells before loading them, whispering quick prayers. Others just watched the sky and hoped the little brain inside would think faster than the man diving toward them. And always, above the sound of guns, came the eternal question: why? Why did the Japanese keep coming? Even after wave upon wave had been torn apart in midair, more planes followed. Some pilots flew obsolete trainers. Others flew without radios or escorts. Many never even reached their targets. But still they came. The answer lay not in strategy but in belief. To them, the kamikaze weren't dying. They were ascending. Each pilot was told his spirit would become a guardian of Japan, protecting it from the invaders. They weren't ordered to die. They were honored to. For the Americans, it was almost impossible to understand. How could you fight an enemy who saw death as victory? And yet, in the face of that fanaticism, it wasn't rage that saved them. It was reason. A spark of human ingenuity born in a lab far away from the front, where scientists who had never seen combat gave sailors the one thing they needed most: a chance. When the final kamikaze raids ended in June, Okinawa was won, but at a staggering cost. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed, and over 30 ships had been sunk. But without the proximity fuse, those numbers would have been 10 times higher. The fuse didn't end the kamikaze threat. It endured to the very last days of the war, but it ensured that Japan's final weapon would fail. After the war, Admiral Lewis Strauss, who oversaw much of the Navy's development, wrote, "The proximity fuse was second only to the atomic bomb in importance to ending the war." He wasn't exaggerating. Because in the spring of 1945, it wasn't a bomb, a plane, or a general that saved the Pacific Fleet. It was an idea that something no larger than a light bulb could outthink death itself. When the guns finally fell silent over Okinawa, the sea was littered with wreckage, the remains of planes, ships, and men from both sides. The sailors who survived stood on decks blackened by fire and smoke, too tired to cheer, too numb to cry. They had seen courage and madness in equal measure, and somewhere, deep inside the twisted remains of anti-aircraft guns, lay fragments of the tiny devices that had made survival possible, fuses that had burned out with their duty fulfilled. The VT fuse never had a face. It had no flag, no uniform, no medals, yet it had saved more lives than any weapon ever built before it. Historians would later call it a masterpiece of engineering, a bridge between the mechanical age and the electronic future. But to the men who loaded those shells, it was something simpler, a silent promise that maybe, just maybe, they'd live to see another sunrise. In Washington, the scientists who created it celebrated quietly. There were no parades, no speeches. Their work had been classified for years. Many would never know how many lives their invention had saved. But they had proven something the war itself had nearly forgotten, that the mind could still be mightier than destruction. For Japan, the kamikaze campaign became a symbol of tragedy, the ultimate act of devotion in a war already lost. Young pilots had given everything they had for a dream that could no longer exist. For America, the proximity fuse marked the dawn of something new. It was more than a fuse. It was the birth of modern electronic warfare, the first step toward guided missiles, radar-controlled defense systems, and the age of precision. In the cold arithmetic of history, it was a victory of logic over despair, of invention over annihilation. Yet those who were there remembered something deeper. They remembered the faces of men, both friend and enemy, consumed by fire, the roar of the sky, the heat of burning oil, the silence after impact. Because in the end, the proximity fuse wasn't just about science or war. It was about time, the few seconds it gave a gunner to breathe, to survive, to see home again. In those final days of the Pacific War, when the world seemed to be ending one explosion at a time, it was that small, unseen flicker of intelligence, inside a fuse no bigger than a man's thumb, that reminded humanity of what it was still capable of, not destruction, but creation. The Kamikaze would be remembered for their sacrifice, the Fuse for its silence, and together, they wrote one of the most haunting chapters of the Second World War, where faith met science in the skies above Okinawa, and the future of warfare was born from the ashes of men who refused to surrender.